Hello everyone, welcome to the video. Today I'm going to go through the Omnibus proposal. I want to talk a little bit about what it is, but to be honest, my message to all sustainability professionals and people when they ask me these questions is always go to the source. Don't rely on my summary of what is being said. Go to the source, and it really annoys me when other sustainability professionals summarize content and they don't provide the links to the original sources. So here is the press release from the EU Commission, February 26, 2025. If you search for this phrase here, Commission simplifies rules on sustainability EU investments. If you search for that phrase in Google, it should take you to this page, the ec.europa.eu Commission website, and here you have the content. This is the summary of the proposal from the EU itself. Always go to the source. Okay, this is kind of what I'm basing my video on as well. This is the proposed Omnibus package. There are more detailed documents on the EU website, but this is the one I would recommend because it gives the best overview. So why have we got this Omnibus? Where is it coming from? What is it affecting? And then I'm going to tell you my opinion of this as a sustainability professional practicing in Europe. Now, before we get into the details of the Omnibus proposal, I want to just hopefully quickly cover the landscape of what is affected by the Omnibus. So there are the main components that we're just kind of talking the same language in this video. Now there are three main components and one sort of side quest associated with what the Omnibus is dealing with. I'm going to draw four kind of blocks to represent these As you can see, my block drawing leaves a little to be desired. I'm going to draw three large blocks and one little block. The first block is the CSRD, okay, and I'm just going to underscore the R because this is largely a reporting directive. There is the EU taxonomy for sustainable finance. I'm going to put a little dollar sign there, or a euro sign is probably more appropriate. That is associated with describing entities for the purposes of investment. Then we have the supply chain, the CSDD, the due diligence directive. I'm going to underscore the S because that's really about supply chain. And then we have something called CBAM, which is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. This is a relatively small piece of the whole current pie, and it's about carbon taxes. So I'm just going to put the word tax there. Okay, we're going to talk about what these are in detail in just a second. Let's start with the CSRD on the left then. The CSRD is the main reporting requirement, and this standardizes the information that companies should publicly disclose. There are some details about what's contained in this requirement. There is a sort of main standard, the full ESRS it's called. No need to worry too much about that. But this contains in the region of 1,000 what are called data points. It's actually more than that, but I don't want to get into the details. It's pretty pointless. There are about 1,000 individual pieces of data which can be reported, and they're spread over around 300 actual kind of questions, let's say. So this is very broad. This is not precise. I know some people are going to correct me and provide exact figures here, but there's really no point getting into the detail. Now, there are around 50,000 companies who would have originally been subject to this. 50,000 companies in the entirety of Europe. This is the entire EU rather, not Europe, but the EU. There are about 50,000 companies who would have had to report CSRD, stepped in 3 or 4 phases, depending on whether you count the non-EU ones, but let's just say phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. Basically large listed companies, large unlisted companies, and then some medium and small sized coming in. And these entry points were phased over time, 2024, 25, 26, up to 27. So there's kind of a phase in for these companies over time. By the end of this process, 50,000 companies would be reporting the CSRD. Okay, let's move on to the taxonomy. The taxonomy is very similar. The taxonomy already existed. It has a lower amount of effort required for it. In fact, the effort for the taxonomy can be very limited depending on how one decides to approach it. Let's say there's about 50 to 100 things you need to report, pieces of information. It's actually less than that, but there is often more work required in some parts of this to get it done. So the effort is not really comparable. It was the same companies who would be required to do taxonomy as CSRD, the same pool of guys, 50,000 companies. CSDDD is more about managing supply chain risk. So it's due diligence in the supply chain. It's got a small reporting or small-ish reporting requirement, but it's more about having a due diligence process in place to check for major social and environmental problems in the supply chain. The CSDDD requirements were not the same. So it's not the same group of companies. It has a higher threshold originally and a later input date. It keeps getting delayed. I think 2026 or something is about the current date for input pre-Omnibus, but like I said, I don't really pay too much attention to the CSDDD because it's not something that's immediately on the delivery radar at the moment. The CSDDD could be quite a lot of work, but I'm thinking in terms of kind of effort, it's probably about that big, the bar, compared to the other two. The taxonomy is probably about here. The CSRD is kind of typically considered to be the one that has the most effort. CBAM then is for a very small group of companies comparatively. It's just those who are importing certain products or certain materials into Europe. They have to calculate the embedded carbon in those products and declare that with the intent of them paying some taxes potentially on those things. I'm not going to talk too much about CBAM today. I really want to focus on these three. These are the bedrock ones, if you ask me, of the kind of Green Deal as it stands currently. These three on the left. Okay, so that's a quick, very fast outline of what the Green Deal kind of pieces currently are that are being subject to change under the Omnibus proposal. Now, this is what the Omnibus is proposing to do. Once again, I'm not going to get into the details. This is broad brush. The Omnibus proposal plans to, first of all, massively change this on the right here, the number of companies who have to report, to reduce that by 85%. Now, this is not a proposal to reduce 85% of their effort. This is a proposal to completely remove those companies from the reporting requirement. The mechanism of doing that is to delay the input from these guys, the phase 2 and 3, is to give them a 2-year delay when they have to start. And then during that delay, they just change the threshold for these guys here. So drop that threshold down slightly. So it becomes large plus a bit, which is any companies over 1,000 employees and with either 50 million revenue or 25 million asset value on their books. Okay, so they're slightly increasing the size of this group. They're going to delay the entry point of these guys and then they'll just never come back in. So that's how they're going to reduce this from about 50,000 companies to something in the region of 6,000 to 8,000 companies. So that is the first thing they're going to do, is they're just going to completely wipe out 85% there or thereabouts. That's the proposal of the companies who have to do this or this. Completely gone. And then they propose to change some of the processes inside the CSDDD to make it easier and affect less companies and affect less of the value chain. And then they propose to add a threshold for CBAM, so far fewer companies will have to do CBAM. But these are the ones that I'm least interested in talking about as well. I really want to focus on CSRD and EU taxonomy. So now we know approximately kind of what the EU is proposing here. They are also proposing, to reduce this number on the left here, the number of data points required for the full standard, for the full reporting. So these guys here, these large guys who continue to report, they're going to reduce the quantity of these data points, these reporting requirements. So not only are they slashing the pool of companies who have to do anything here, they're also reducing the amount of information included in this standard, the full standard. Okay, that is a very messy diagram to explain this. I could not be bothered producing something sexy. I hope people could follow what I'm talking about. Now let's move on to discussing some of the kind of principles of what the purpose of this is in the first place. And then does the proposal that the EU is proposing, the Commission is proposing, does that actually align with what the Draghi report recommended? Is there consistency between these two things? So here's the press release the EU published. This is worth reading if you want to understand kind of from the source, I guess. You can search for this phrase. Commission simplifies rules on sustainability and EU investment. So we'll take you to this press release. There's a bullet point list of the proposals here. So main changes in the area of sustainability reporting. This applies to the CSRD and the taxonomy. So here they're saying they're removing around 80% of companies from the scope of the CSRD. I think 80 to 85. I don't know where I got 85 actually, but anyway, it doesn't matter. 80%, 85%. It's the same magnitude. Somehow ensuring that sustainability and reporting requirements on large companies do not burden smaller companies. I don't see how that was already a burden anyway. I don't understand what the Commission is talking about there. Postponing, that's what we talked about before, the phase 2 and 3 guys, postponing, reducing the burden of the taxonomy obligations. And then this stuff is a bit sort of detailed here, increasing of financial material. This is sort of methodology stuff. But I mean, the highlight items here, which I just explained in that crazy drawing, are the same as, you know, the ideas that are being proposed by the EU. It's really, really important to note this one here. It's basically the slashing of the number of companies who are in scope, full stop. That is really the key to all of this, in my opinion. So let's go back to the original proposal for the CSRD in the first place. This is the original CSRD. This is the directive. And I'm just going to copy some text here so I can find this paragraph again because we're going to be rolling around. So here's the CSRD from 2022. The preamble to European regulations or directives always explains why the European Parliament is doing what it's doing. So we can sort of read through this and get a feeling. Now, it's really important to note why the EU Commission or the EU Parliament originally wanted the CSRD. And it's based on partly this thing called the European Action Plan Financing Sustainable Growth. So there's an intention to direct finance or to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investment in order to achieve sustainable growth and inclusive growth. So this is about the economy. This is about the broader European economy. Managing financial risks which stem from climate change. This is in the interests of companies to manage these risks. To manage resource depletion. It is in the interests of the economy to manage resource depletion, to manage environmental degradation and manage our social issues. These things are in our interests. And to foster transparency and long-termism in financial activity. Now, these are goods. We have to think of these as goods. I don't know many Europeans who would say these things are not goods. And notice here, transparency itself is on the list. Transparency is an end goal. Why is transparency an end goal? Now, I would argue, and I'm going to argue, it doesn't matter whether you are on the left or the right of the political spectrum. If you believe in free market economics or if you believe in government-directed markets or people-directed markets, either way, the concept of transparency is critical to make markets function. And I'm not just making this up. Anyone who's studied basic economics, you probably remember from high school or maybe your first year university courses, Adam Smith and the Invisible Hand. Information is necessary for consumers to make decisions, and not just price information. We also have a wealth of commentary on this topic from both people who sit on the social or the left side of political argument and economic understanding, and those who sit on the conservative or the right-hand side of politics. It is pretty universally agreed that transparency is a good. So let's look at some of these kinds of publications. The ICMA has a really interesting paper and documentation about transparency in markets, what it is and how it affects markets. Really interesting paper here from Antonio Scaglia and Valerio Vacca looking at market transparency case studies. We have European Commission's own papers on the aims of market transparency. What is market transparency? What are the goals of transparency? Academic papers, market transparency, who wins and who loses. This paper here I just want to highlight is a really interesting one, and it's kind of narrowly focused on securities trading, but I think it says something about transparency and how markets work. It's called Can Transparent Markets Survive? It was published in the Journal of Finance in 2000. And it's worth just talking through the abstract conclusions here because it is interesting, and then you could read the full paper if you want. So the idea is to investigate whether transparent markets can survive when faced with direct competition from less transparent markets. Now, this is an argument that the commissioners have been using. This was explicitly made in the press statement. So if you got the chance to watch that, having read this paper, go back and listen to what the commissioners were claiming. It's quite interesting. So first of all, there is a constructed game model in the study, and it is used to test whether low transparency dealers, that is the low transparency traders who choose not to be transparent, capture early order flow and can use the resulting information advantage they have, so they've got information that they're not being transparent about, to quote narrower spreads and earn more profits than the more transparent competitors. Okay, this is the argument that the non-transparent dealers will trade better. They conducted a laboratory experiment that tested and supports these predictions. Okay, so initially this is supported. Being low transparency does give you an advantage in a market where there are high transparent competitors. However, this is a very short-term advantage. So they conducted a second experiment to show that most dealers will then choose to be intransparent. This also goes to the commission. The commission seems to suggest that making all of this voluntary will incentivize companies to voluntarily report. This study suggests the opposite is true. When transparency is voluntary and there are actors who are incentivized to be intransparent, most dealers will choose to be of lower transparency when they are allowed to do so. There is a natural pull in the short term to be intransparent because it produces short-term advantages. So the EU seem completely unaware of this mechanism. However, informational advantage of low transparency decreases as there are more such dealers. So the initial advantage that the dealer has from being intransparent decreases as everybody else follows suit. So it's only worthwhile being intransparent in the short term, and it's only worthwhile doing this so long as others aren't also becoming intransparent. But we know that most dealers will choose to be intransparent. This is a bad outcome for the market. This will produce a negative reinforcement to behavior which harms the market. Now, it's worth also noticing here, the informational advantage of low transparency decreases as there are more such traders, while the high transparency dealers get increasing benefit from informed traders who attempt to broadcast deceptive trades. So those traders who then broadcast deceptive trades benefit in the long term. The high transparent ones who expose the bad trading will benefit in the long term. As a result, a small number of transparent dealers persist. So currently, the natural mechanism is short-term gain for intransparency, some long-term benefits for transparency, so long as traders are allowed to be intransparent. People will naturally try to take advantage of the short-term benefits of intransparency. Now, this is focusing on securities trading, but I think it doesn't require too much of a jump to expand this kind of behavior to other parts of the market. And the reason I'm showing all these papers is trying to make the point here that transparency in and of itself is a good. Now, the reason I'm making that point is because there have been a few commentators, both in the sustainability environment and from the Commission, talking about this concept of reporting for reporting's sake. They want to get rid of reporting for reporting's sake. I would argue that is contrary to the EU's own opinion that transparency is a good. Nobody is reporting, or the intent here is not reporting for reporting's sake. The CSRD does not require reporting for reporting's sake. It requires reporting for transparency's sake, because transparency has been universally declared by the European Parliament and the Commission to be a good. That is the end point. Transparency is the end goal. Now, here's another way of putting that. If you were sick, let's say you became sick, and there were two companies on the market offering you a cure. Company A, let's draw a picture. So you become ill, and there are two companies on the market offering the cure. Company A and Company B. So they're both selling medicine which can cure you. Now let's say the price of medicine from Company A is $100, 100 euros, and the price from Company B is 125 euros. Let's say you just have price information. All you know is that Company A produces it and sells it for that, and Company B produces and sells it for that. You're almost certainly going to pick this one because it's cheaper. However, what if you found out that Company A was the company responsible for making you sick in the first place? Would you still be willing to give them 100 euros of your money to pay for the medicine, knowing that they were responsible for making you sick? Would you rather spend a little bit more giving the money to a company that did not make you sick, and despite that developed medicine to help you feel better? I am willing to bet that most people, barring some extraneous circumstances, would be prepared to pay more for a product which they believe to be morally and ethically superior to the one which they believe to be morally inferior and perhaps even morally abhorrent. Now that is what transparency does. The fact that you found out what Company A was up to, its ethics, its governance, its approach to its customers, those are sustainability issues. The fact that you knew that this company was operating in a way that was morally reprehensible enabled you to make a more informed decision. And yes, it may have cost you slightly more financially, but we are not purely financial actors. Humans have loads of frameworks by which we make our decisions, and it's not always purely based on a few euros being in our pockets. We make decisions based on other factors, and we need to recognize that. And so this is an example of why transparency is, in my argument, a good, because it allows the consumer to be informed. Transparency is for the benefit of the consumer. That is why we need transparency in the market about what are companies up to. How are they treating our environment? How are they treating their workforce? How are they treating their customers? How well are they governed? None of that information is readily available if you just look at the balance sheet. This is why sustainability reporting and sustainability transparency is so important. Another thing I want to address in this video is this fear of the reporting burden being too high. So we looked earlier about the fact that there are 1,000 plus data points in the CSRD or the ESRS. So there's the standard, the ESRS, that contains a lot of data points. That is true. And this has been used by certain people in the market and by certain politicians to undermine, destabilize the reporting effort by claiming there are so many data points and this is too much of a burden. Now, what if I told you that there is a mechanism inside the ESRS already? It's already in there. This does not require any new legislation. This does not require any new commission proposals. This is an existing mechanism that we are already using in practice. Companies are already using this. It's completely legal. It's actually required. It is a required mechanism of the standard to filter and reduce the number of data points a company has to report. It's already there. And I know companies, and I can show you sustainability statements produced already from these companies who have reported in the region of 500 data points. They have 50% reduced the reporting burden simply by following the processes that are already in the standard. All they needed to do was comply in order to reduce their reporting burden. Instead of not starting and just staring at this 1,000 data points and getting all upset and whinging and complaining about the reporting burden, all you have to do is actually start the process, get rid of huge swathes of your reporting burden, and then worry about reporting. Now, the process for getting rid of these reporting requirements is called materiality. That is what materiality is about. It is about taking the full reporting burden and reducing it down to the reporting burden which is material for your company. This is a very straightforward process. Materiality is not that complicated. There are already loads of companies who have done this. There are tools that have been developed. There are services that have been developed. There are approaches that have been developed to make this happen. This is being done. This has been done. There is no need to focus on this 1,000 data points, because almost no companies will actually have to report 1,000 data points. So when the EU Commission starts talking about 25% reductions in reporting burden, up to 80% reductions in reporting burden, it seems to me they've completely ignored the fact that the mechanism for reducing the reporting burden is already in the existing standard. They're just not using it. Now, the cynical part of me suggests that these politicians and some of their lobbyists have deliberately ignored this. They are deliberately not talking about it because they know what this mechanism is for, and they actually want to undermine the reporting process. The generous part of me thinks they just haven't been informed and they are not aware of how effective this is. So I would suggest the Commission is either naive at best, but the cynical part of me suggests that maybe there's something deliberate going on here. Let's come to another cost-saving measure that hasn't really been talked about, but I think would be super, super effective, and that is the audit burden. So under the CSRD, there is the requirement currently for limited assurance of sustainability statements, and in the future, the proposal was to move towards reasonable assurance. The EU has decided that for the companies who have to keep reporting, they will fix the assurance to limited assurance. That is limited assurance according to existing accounting rules for assurance. So what limited assurance means is defined for accounting, but it's not really been defined yet for sustainability reporting because the member states were supposed to draft their own limited assurance standards. Most of them have not done this. So we're in the situation where limited assurance for sustainability reporting is not really understood. And the companies that have been getting assurance have been paying, in my opinion, far too much for it. I know some actual examples where companies have conducted double materiality. They've spent about 5,000 to 10,000 euros on double materiality. And then they have been quoted 50 to 80,000 euros just for the assurance of a process that only cost them 10,000 euros to do. Now, this to me is complete bonkers. And if anyone wants to talk about reducing the reporting burden and the costs associated with reporting, this is where they should be looking. This ridiculous audit burden. How do we deal with this audit burden? One, and this should have been done already, this is just laziness on the behalf of politicians. And I've got to say, despite kind of voting in the left/green direction myself politically, left-wing and green politicians have failed Germany in particular here, and that is they never drafted these limited assurance reporting standards. And they should have. This is one thing they should have gone on to immediately, was collapsing and restricting the scope of what limited assurance means for sustainability reporting to bring those costs down from these ridiculous sums of 50,000 euros down to a couple of days' work. Limited assurance was never properly defined. And in my opinion, some assurance companies have been taking sustainability reporting preparers for a ride with the bills they've been charging and what they've been quoting for their work. The second thing is, this is what I would strongly recommend to the Commission, open up assurance to certification partners. So instead of requiring that assurance may only be carried out by qualified assuring partners, open it up to certification. And this is the companies like TÜV in Germany, companies like DEKRA. These are companies who already certify sustainability information. They are really, really used to this. It is bread and butter for these guys to certify carbon accounting, to certify sustainability reports under other frameworks. And they've been completely locked out of the assurance of sustainability reporting under the CSRD. That should never have happened. This is where the expertise lies when it comes to reviewing sustainability information. So I think the Commission and the original proposal for the CSRD completely failed the sustainability market because it blew up the assurance requirements and it made assurance very expensive. And this is one area where I still think they've got time and I still think they should be putting their focus in. Deal with the assurance burden. Of course, if they want help with this, they need to come to the practicing community. They need to come to the likes of TÜV and DEKRA, companies that are already preparing sustainability statements, who've been through this process, find out from the practice community exactly what has happened. This isn't talking to lobby groups and other vested interests. Talk to the companies who've already done this. This assurance burden needs to be dealt with immediately. This is a huge disproportionate part of the costs. If the EU is concerned about proportionality, there you go, guys. There's your target, assurance. We're getting sort of close to the end of this video. There's so many things I would like to talk about on this topic, but I'm going to try and squeeze a few other points into the end here. The first point is, has the proposal from the Commission matched the expectations? Now, we see expectations expressed in a number of EU documents already, right? 25% reductions in reporting burden. There it is. Targets to reduce reporting burdens by at least 25% for all companies and 35% for SMEs. That is what they were originally tasked with doing. Have they proposed anything like that? No, the answer is no. So let's go 25% reduction overall and a 35% for SMEs. What they've done is they've taken 80% or 80 to 85% of companies out of the burden entirely. That is a 100% reduction for 80% of companies. You don't have to be a genius or a math whiz to understand that reducing the number of companies from 50,000 down to 8,000 or so is nowhere near a reduction of 35% in the burden for SMEs. It's a complete reduction. It's 100% reporting gone. This is a wipeout. This is not simplification. They have not simplified anything here. They've just gone and said, no, forget about it. Gone. This is just complete deregulation. 25% for large companies. Now, this is arguably something they are kind of moving towards. There are proposals to go into the standard and to reduce some of the data points in the standard, but I've already shown you how that's done already. Just a decent double materiality process will do that for you. So there's no legislation required for that. I do agree the taxonomy is overly complex and the taxonomy should be given some thought. I've never been a fan of the taxonomy. I certainly think the taxo is one area where I would focus some regulatory attention. The CSRD though, the ESRS, okay, I've got a quick proposal for the CSRD and then I want to talk about the CSDDD and then I'm closing out the video. Okay, we're just getting onto my sort of random opinions now. So let's take the CSRD. First thing, EFRAG is the company who was who won the commission to draft the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. They drafted the ESRS, and then they drafted a voluntary standard for small companies, which is the VSME, and they've also drafted an intermediary standard called the listed SME standard. Now, the original intention is that the largest companies would report this, the slightly smaller ones who were listed would report this, and there was a voluntary standard for anyone else who didn't have to report but just wanted to align. What I would do if I was the commission, I would look at removing some duplications and some of the data points inside the ESRS. Yes, I think there is room to streamline this standard, to simplify and streamline this standard, the reporting requirements. There are some overlapping requirements in certain chapters which could be removed, and there's some lack of clarity, right? There are some things I would remove here. One of the areas I would deal with is some of the narratives. Some of the narrative disclosures. Just tidying them up so they read better. Another problem is the split between disclosure requirements and application requirements in the standard. This is a technical thing. It's incredibly ugly. It's hard to follow. I would have the standard rewritten so the application and the disclosure requirements are collapsed together. If an AR applies to a DR, just make it part of the DR. So the standard is ugly. Yes, I will give that. In my opinion, it wasn't particularly well written. And it can be simplified, and I think that could be done. LSME standard is wonderful. This standard is great. EFRAG learned a lot of lessons from the ESRS when they drafted the LSME, in my opinion, and this could be the standard that everybody could report to, or this should be the standard that the medium-sized companies should report to. This would reduce their burden. Just saying this is your standard would reduce the reporting burden by about that 30% mark. It's already been drafted. This standard has been written. All the commission needs to do is say, medium guys, you don't need to do this one. You can just do the mediums, the LSME standard, which was already kind of the plan. This is on top of double materiality already dealing with this. So there's some really, really easy moves they could do to achieve the goals of the Draghi report and their own stated goals. The voluntary standard is just a standard for anyone who wants to report voluntarily but wants to use the same format and the same kind of metrics as the guys who are reporting for regulatory purposes. So the VSME standard kind of doesn't matter for this video, but the mechanism is already here. Like, I don't want to have to repeat myself too many times, but it feels to me like the Commission has completely ignored the mechanisms they already have at their disposal for achieving their goals. And they've come up with something which is completely disproportionate. Let's look at the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, so the CSDDD. Right, the CSDDD, what it's supposed to do, here you are that's your business, and you've got your upstream suppliers. And the CSRD is supposed to get you to look for sustainability-related risks or problems in your supply chain, right? This is breaches of human rights, major pollution events, environmental problems. It's the same thing we talked about earlier. If you are buying things from unscrupulous actors, then you are supporting them with your money. Should your customers know that you're buying stuff from companies who are up to no good? Yes, your customers should know, right? They should have that information available to them, and you should be doing something to reduce those risks. Now, interestingly, the CSRD, the reporting requirements, already asks companies to look at impacts, negative impacts in their value chain. This is coming from the CSRD. So on this side, you've got the CSDDD telling companies to look for negative activities in their value chain and do some due diligence on those, manage them in some way. And we've got the ESRS, the CSRD over here, which tells companies to measure the severity and the likelihood of negative impacts in their value chain and report on them. So you've got two entirely different acts or directives telling companies to do the same thing using slightly different words. One includes a due diligence process and one does not. Collapse these two things together. That's all we need to do. Just get rid of this DDD nonsense for now. Nonsense. Focus on transparency, which is identification of these Value chain impacts. The CSRD also says explain how you are managing them. Now, if a company is not managing them, then the company should just say, hey, there are major problems in my supply chain and I'm not doing anything about it. Let the customer know. Let your consumers know. Yes, my value chain is dirty and I am doing nothing to manage my value chain. The ESRS already asks them for that. It asks for transparency. So why not just leverage the existing mechanism of the ESRS, the CSRD, to deal with value chain impacts, which you already have to do, and let companies be transparent about it. And then we can consider whether we need to bring in some due diligence requirements or some action requirements. But remember, the first step and one of the major mechanisms of correcting a market is transparency. This is why transparency is good. If your customers know that you are up to shenanigans, maybe they will stop buying from you. And that is part of what we're talking about here. Now, there will obviously be people who completely disagree with the idea that a transparent market helps consumers make decisions. There are others who would say that it's only affluent consumers who can choose better products, and that poorer, less affluent consumers are unable to choose better products. But for me, that sounds patronizing. That patronizes people with lower buying power. I would like to argue that people who are poorer, who are less able to exert financial leverage, are still capable of making moral decisions. It doesn't make them amoral or immoral simply because they lack financial power. Anyway, this is probably something for philosophers to discuss. I'm getting way off scope here, but my argument here is that a lot of the mechanisms of the CSDDD are already built into the CSRD anyway, and there is perhaps no need for a full secondary piece of legislation here. That maybe the goals of the CSDDD kind of partly exist in here anyway. Okay, that's getting close to the end of this video. The summary point of this is, I think the Omnibus proposal has completely overlooked the landscape. It has overlooked the mechanisms that already exist for reducing reporting burden, and it has far overstepped the mandate from the Draghi report, from the Commission itself, and from the EU Parliament to reduce reporting burden. It's gone way too far, and it has become somewhat ridiculous, and it's really just deregulation.